Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 8 of the most disturbing true cruise ship stories ever submitted to this channel. Passengers, crew members, and former officers sent these in. And these aren't campfire inventions. Too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-checked the details where we could, and they line up with internal crew records and maritime incident reports that were never meant to leave the ship. Before we start, 3 quick previews. No spoilers. A woman traveling alone on a transatlantic crossing hears 3 knocks outside her cabin every night at exactly the same minute, until the knocking stops and something whispers her name instead. A name she never gave to anyone on board. A night shift cleaner on a Caribbean route learns to recognize a smell that shows up minutes before something happens. And one night, she hears footsteps falling into step behind her, matching her pace exactly, half a step back, with no one there, and a retired purser spends decades trying not to think about one specific cabin number, on one specific ship, because every few years, someone checks in, and nobody official ever asks why they didn't check out. If you're new here, subscribe and turn the bell on. This channel isn't about cheap jump scares. It's about slow burning, patient horror, the kind that stays with you, because it's rooted in something real. Let's get into it. I want to say up front that I am not the kind of person who believes in this stuff. I read return policies before I buy things online. I keep every receipt for a year. When my sister forwards me those videos of a shadow moving in someone's hallway, I send back the article about pareidolia and go back to whatever I was doing. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand that I fought every non-boring explanation for as long as I possibly could. I booked the crossing the year after my mother died. She used to talk about doing one of those repositioning cruises, the kind where a ship moves from Europe down to the Caribbean for the winter season, and they sell off the empty cabins cheap because nobody wants 8 days at sea with no ports in between. She never went. I was 35, freshly divorced, sitting on unused vacation days. So I went instead. Interior cabin, deck 6, no balcony, the cheapest room on the ship. I told myself it was about the ocean air. I didn't look at that reasoning too hard. The first knock came on the second night out, at 3:14 in the morning. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced, not urgent, almost polite. I was awake because the time change announcement had thrown off my body clock, so I got up right away, thinking it was room service confused about cabins, and I opened the door within maybe 10 seconds. The hallway was empty in both directions. Not just empty like someone had ducked around a corner. Empty like nobody had been there long enough to leave a smell, a sound, anything. I stood there in my socks feeling stupid and went back to bed. In the morning, I called down to guest services out of simple irritation, expecting them to apologize for a mixed-up delivery. The woman on the phone checked the log and told me nobody had been dispatched to deck 6 at all that night. Not for room service, not for maintenance, nothing. I remember laughing it off to her, saying maybe another passenger had the wrong door. She didn't laugh back. She just said she'd note it, and moved on quickly to asking if there was anything else she could help me with. The second night, the knocks came again, and this is the part that actually got under my skin before anything supernatural did. They came at exactly 3:14 again, not around that time. Exactly. I'd checked my watch out of habit the first night, and I checked it again the second, and both times the numbers matched to the minute. Coincidences don't usually keep a schedule like that. What changed on the second night was the location. The knocking wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside my closet, from the wall at the back of it. 3 knocks, same spacing, same rhythm. I actually laughed out loud when I heard it, because it seemed too on the nose, like something out of a movie, and some part of my brain refused to be scared by something so obvious. I got up and opened the closet and put my hand flat against the back panel. It was cold in a way the rest of the cabin wasn't. I looked closer the next morning with the closet light on, and I found something I hadn't noticed when I unpacked. The back panel of the closet had a seam running down it that didn't match the rest of the woodwork, and the paint just past the hanging rod was a slightly different shade of white, like someone had patched drywall there and repainted only that section rather than the whole wall. I'm not a contractor, but I know what a wall looks like after it's been closed up. because I did that exact repair to my own basement 2 years ago. I mentioned it to the cabin steward, a younger guy named Dario, who'd been friendly enough the first 2 days, refilling my ice bucket and asking how my trip was going. I asked him, casually, if he knew anything about the layout of the cabin, whether it used to be bigger. He went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of quiet where someone is choosing their words instead of not having any. He said he'd only been assigned to this ship for 1 season and didn't know its history, then asked if I needed extra towels, and left before I could ask anything else. The 3rd night, there was no knocking at all. Instead, at 3:14, someone whispered my name once, close enough to the wall that it didn't sound far away, and far enough that it wasn't in the room with me. Not my legal name. The name my mother used to call me when I was small. A name that never made it onto any booking form, any passport, any guest manifest. A name nobody on that ship had any way of knowing. I sat up in the dark and didn't move for a long time. The next day, instead of asking staff directly, I went to the ship's small library, where they keep a rack of old cruise line brochures for passengers who like that sort of thing. And I found out the vessel had originally sailed under a different name and a different flag decades earlier, before being sold, refitted, and rebranded twice. There was an enrichment lecturer on board, a retired officer who gave an afternoon talk about the ship's history to a room of maybe 12 people, mostly older couples. I stayed after and asked him, off to the side, if he had access to the original deck plans from before the last major refit. He did, as it turned out, kept on an old hard drive he used for his talks, and he pulled them up on his laptop right there in the library, without much hesitation, since to him it was just ship trivia, not a ghost story. What I saw made my stomach drop in a very quiet way. My cabin, 6104, had originally been half of a larger suite, connected by an interior door to the cabin next to it, 6106. That connecting door was exactly where my closet now stood. I asked what happened to 6106. He scrolled through his notes and told me it had been sealed off during a refit in the early 90s, converted into crew storage, and was no longer accessible from the passenger hallway at all. When I asked why it had been sealed rather than just kept as a second cabin, he shrugged and said the refit paperwork he had access to just listed it as a structural change. No reason given. He didn't seem bothered by that. I was. That night I lay awake doing math I had no business doing at that hour. The ship's clocks had moved back an hour twice already on this crossing, adjusting for time zones as we crossed the Atlantic. Announced over the PA each evening so people could reset their watches. If the knocking was simply happening on a 24-hour cycle, the actual clock time should have drifted along with those changes. It hadn't. Whatever was keeping that appointment wasn't following the clock on my nightstand. It was following something else, something that didn't care what number the ship had decided to call the hour. I went back to Dario the next day and pushed harder than I probably should have, and something in my tone must have cracked whatever professional wall he'd been keeping up, because he finally admitted, quietly, that some of the crew avoided walking that stretch of the Deck 6 hallway alone at night if they could help it, and that there was an old nickname for it among the housekeeping staff, something he wouldn't repeat to me directly. He said it like it embarrassed him to believe it, which somehow made it worse than if he'd said it with conviction. Later that same day, a woman at guest services named Corazon, who I'd noticed had been on this ship for a long time based on how the younger staff deferred to her, caught me in the hallway after her shift ended and asked, quietly, if I was the woman in 6104. When I said yes, she asked if I had a few minutes, off the record, over coffee in the crew mess she wasn't technically supposed to invite me into. She told me that decades earlier, under the ship's original name, a passenger had disappeared from that cabin during a transatlantic crossing. The door had been locked from the inside. The life vest was still there. Nobody ever found a body, and the case was closed as a presumed accident at sea. The kind cruise lines don't advertise, but don't fully forget either. She said the passenger's name had been recorded as Rose Hale. I asked her to repeat it, because Hale was my mother's maiden name, and it isn't a common one. I called my sister that night from the ship's spotty satellite connection, and she confirmed something I'd only ever heard as a vague, half-embarrassed family story, the kind adults mention once and then wave off when a kid asks follow-up questions. Our great-aunt Rose had gone on an ocean crossing in the 70s, and never really came back the same. Except she actually hadn't come back at all. She'd been reported lost at sea, and the family had simply stopped talking about it after a generation, the way families do with the things that don't have tidy endings. Our mother, it turned out, had spent years wanting to make that same crossing herself, and had never once told either of us why. On the last night before we docked, 314 came and went in complete silence, and for the first time, I felt something closer to disappointment than relief, which unsettled me more than the knocking ever had. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, the whisper came again, except this time it wasn't through the wall. It was right behind me, close enough that I felt it more than heard it, saying the same name my mother used to call me. I turned around fast enough to knock my elbow into the nightstand, and there was nobody there, obviously, but the closet door, which I had wedged shut with a luggage strap after the second night, was standing wide open. Tucked into the seam at the back of that closet, in the exact spot where the old connecting door used to be, was a small tarnished silver hairpin, the kind nobody wears anymore, with 2 tiny initials engraved on the flat end, R and H. I disembarked the next morning like everyone else, rolling my suitcase down a gangway into ordinary daylight, and I never got an official answer from the cruise line beyond a polite email saying cabin 6106 was used for crew storage, and they had no further records to share. I still have that hairpin in a drawer at home, and some nights I take it out and just hold it, trying to decide what I actually believe. I still don't know what was in that other room. I just know it knew my name before I ever gave it. I've been cleaning ships for 6 years now, mostly nights, mostly the parts of the boat passengers never see. Crew corridors, laundry chutes, the service stairwells that connect the guts of the ship to itself. You get used to smells down there. Bleach, diesel, wet carpet that never fully dries, no matter how many times you run the extractor over it. So when I first noticed the other smell, I didn't think much of it. Seawater, but heavier, and underneath it, something sweet that didn't belong, like fruit going soft in a bag you forgot about. It came and went near the service stairwell on deck 2, and I figured it was runoff from the galley trash chute 1 level up. I sprayed enamel cleaner around the frame, checked the drain grate, found nothing, and moved on with my cart. It kept showing up though, and always around the same time. Not just some nights. Every night I worked that section, somewhere between 12:40 and 1 in the morning, I started timing it without meaning to, glancing at my watch out of habit before I even reached that corner. That was the first thing that should have told me this wasn't plumbing. Plumbing doesn't keep a schedule. Then Marisol, who runs the linen cart 2 decks up, but sometimes covers for me on turnaround nights, came and found me at the crew mess and said something had brushed past her in the aft corridor outside the laundry. She said it like she was embarrassed to say it, like she already knew how it would sound. She said she felt a shoulder, close enough to move the fabric of her sleeve, and when she turned around, the hallway was empty both directions. No doors open, nowhere anyone could have gone. I told her it was probably the AC system cycling, air pressure shifting when a watertight door opens somewhere else on the same line. She nodded like she wanted to believe me. I wanted to believe me too. I went and pulled the camera log for that corridor the next afternoon, mostly to put my own mind at ease, and that's when it stopped being something I could explain away. There was a gap, 90 seconds of nothing, a frozen frame that didn't move, right around the time Marisol said she felt it. I scrolled back through the archive, 3 nights, 5 nights, and there it was again and again, the exact same length, the exact same window, give or take a minute. A malfunctioning camera glitches randomly. This one glitched on a schedule. I brought it to the security office because I didn't know what else to do with it, and the officer on duty, an older guy who'd clearly heard every kind of complaint a cruise ship generates, told me the system down there was original build, past its service life, and that IT had a ticket open on it already. He said it the way you say something to close a conversation, not open one. I asked if I could see the ticket. He said he'd have someone follow up. Nobody ever did. After that, I started noticing my own footsteps had company. Not all the time, just on the long stretch of corridor past the laundry chute, where the fluorescent tubes buzz instead of hum. I'd hear a second set of steps, just slightly off my own rhythm, always half a beat behind, like something learning to walk the way I walk. I stopped and it stopped. I started again and so did it. I told myself it was an echo off the steel bulkheads, sound bouncing weird in a low-ceilinged space, and for a while, that got me through the shift. Then I found the water. Not a leak, not condensation. Footprints, wet ones, leading up the service stairwell that dead ends at deck 2. Bare, from what I could tell, spaced like someone walking normally, climbing toward the landing where the stairwell just stops. There's no door up there, no hatch, no maintenance access, nothing on the deck plan that says anything continues past that point. The prints ended at a blank wall, like whoever made them had walked up out of nowhere and simply stopped existing at that landing. I stood there with my mop bucket and didn't move for a long time. I asked around after that, carefully, because I didn't want to be the woman who saw ghosts on deck 2. I found an engineer, older, close to retirement, who'd been with the company since before this hull was even finished in the yard. I asked him, half joking, if there used to be anything past that stairwell. He didn't laugh. He got quiet in a way that told me the question landed somewhere real, and he said there used to be a lower service deck there, sealed off before the ship ever left the shipyard, and that officially it never existed in any deck plan a passenger or new crew member would ever see. He told me, because I think by then he was tired of carrying it alone, that a worker died down there during construction. A fall, he said, though he said it like there was more to it he wasn't going to give me. The company closed the deck rather than deal with the delay and the paperwork a death like that generates. And once the ship sailed, that whole section simply stopped being mentioned. Not covered up in any dramatic sense, just quietly folded out of every training manual and every induction packet that came after. I thought that was the end of it. An old sad fact finally explaining a bad feeling, and for a few weeks it almost was. But then, going through the logbook out of nothing better to do on a slow crossing, I found 2 more incidents tied to that same stretch of hull, years apart, both filed as unrelated structural issues, both happening within the same week of the calendar year. 3 deaths, not 1, all quietly folded into maintenance language, instead of anything that would draw an investigation. That's when I understood this wasn't a story about one accident. It was a pattern somebody had been managing for a long time. I started looking harder, and I found something that made my stomach drop in a different way. A name in a crew separation file from earlier that same season. A laundry hand who'd worked my exact rotation before I did. Listed as having left the ship early for personal reasons. I remembered her. We'd trained together for 2 weeks before she rotated to a different section. Nobody ever mentioned why she left so suddenly, and when I asked a supervisor, he said only that it happens. Contracts end early sometimes. I didn't believe him anymore. I don't think I'd believed anyone in months. One night, near the end of that contract, I went down to that stairwell one more time, not for work, just because I needed to see it with my own eyes and stop letting my imagination run further than the facts. The smell hit me stronger than it ever had, sweet and wrong, and the footsteps started, before I'd even reached the bottom step, right on my heel, instead of half a beat behind. The temperature dropped enough that I could see my own breath in a hallway that's supposed to sit at a steady 72 degrees. I got to the landing, put my hand flat against that dead wall, and for 1 full second I swear the wall was warm. Warmer than skin has any right to be in a place that cold. I didn't wait to feel it a second time. I wrote up everything I'd found, the deaths, the crew separation, the camera pattern, and handed it to my department head, expecting an investigation, or at least a conversation. Instead, I got a quiet meeting in a small office, a reassignment to a different rotation on a different deck, and a request, phrased politely, but not really a request, that I not bring this up with newer crew. I asked why, and the answer I got was that this kind of thing, once it starts moving through a crew mess as a story, never really stops, and it costs the company more in staff turnover than in liability. That was the moment I understood the company wasn't hiding a ghost. They were hiding the cost of one. I still work nights. I've been offered day rotations twice, and turned them both down, because the money's better at night, and because some stubborn part of me doesn't want to let that stairwell win. But I don't take deck 2 anymore. I traded sections with someone quietly, no explanation given, and none asked for, which tells you something about how many people already know better than to ask. Last month I saw a new hire coming off that corridor, pale and quiet, moving too fast for someone just finishing a normal shift. And I recognized the look, because I used to wear it myself. I didn't say anything to her. I don't think I could have explained it in a way that wouldn't have sounded insane. And some part of me, the part that still smells that sweetness some nights even 3 decks away, isn't sure I want her walking those halls with my voice in her head, listening for footsteps that match her own. I spent 6 years as a nurse on cruise ships before I left the industry for good, and out of everything I logged in that job, the sprained ankles, the food poisoning, the one cardiac arrest I still dream about, there's only one case I can't file away. I've told this story maybe 4 times in a decade, always to other medical people, because I need someone with a clinical brain to tell me I'm wrong about what I saw. Nobody ever has. It was a Mediterranean run, early spring. The ship may be half full, that quiet stretch of the season before the summer crowds. Day 2 out of port. A woman came into the medical bay around 10 in the morning. Walked in on her own, no appointment. She said she hadn't slept in 4 days, and she wanted to know if I had something for it. I remember thinking she didn't look like someone who hadn't slept in 4 days. No shadows under the eyes, no tremor, none of the flat effect you see in real sleep deprivation. She was alert, articulate, a little impatient, like she was more annoyed by the inconvenience than frightened by it. So I ran the standard workup: blood pressure, pulse, oxygen, a quick neurocheck. And here's the first thing that didn't sit right with me. Everything was normal, not borderline normal, not the kind of normal you squint at and decide is fine. Textbook. Her heart rate was actually lower than you'd expect for someone anxious about their own body failing them. 4 days without sleep should show up somewhere. Cortisol, blood pressure, something. I told her I wanted to keep an eye on her, gave her the standard advice: melatonin, hydration, reduce screen time, and she just nodded along like she was humoring me. Before she left, I asked the obvious question: trouble falling asleep or trouble staying asleep? And she looked at me for a second too long and said no. I lie down, I close my eyes, and I can't. Not won't, can't. Like the word itself was the wrong shape for what was happening to her, and she'd already tried a dozen other words and given up. I didn't think much more about it until the next afternoon, when one of the bar stewards mentioned, almost as a joke, that the woman from cabin 412 had said something strange to him. He'd asked how her cruise was going, small talk, and she'd said, word for word, he told me, I think it's still deciding what it wants from me. He laughed it off at the time. Then an hour later, a different steward, on a different deck, mentioned that the same passenger had said almost the identical sentence to her. Same phrasing, same flat tone. And when the steward asked what she meant, the woman looked confused and said she hadn't spoken to anyone all morning. 2 crew members, 2 different decks, 1 sentence repeated verbatim, and she had no memory of either conversation. That was the point I stopped treating it as a sleep complaint and started treating it as something I needed to actually watch. Her cabin mate was a work friend she'd booked the trip with, and I pulled her aside on day 4. She didn't want to talk about it at first, which told me plenty on its own. Eventually she admitted that Anne, that was the passenger's name, Anne, had been talking at night, not tossing and turning, not mumbling, full sentences, sustained, for hours, while lying rigid on her back with her eyes open. The cabin mate said the voice wasn't right. I asked her what she meant by that, expecting an answer about tone or volume, and she said it was slower than Anne's real voice, and it used words Anne didn't use. And once, around 3 in the morning, it had said her name, the cabin mate's name, without her ever having introduced herself using that name on the trip. I want to be honest that at this point I did something I probably shouldn't have. I asked ship security if we could put a monitor in the cabin, framed it as a wellness check given the sleep complaint, and got a baby monitor rigged up with the cabin mate's permission while she bunked in a spare crew cabin for a night. I watched most of the footage live from the medical bay because I couldn't make myself go to bed either. By that point, for the first 2 hours there was nothing. Anne lying on top of the covers, perfectly still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Then around 2 a.m., her lips started moving. No sound on the feed at first, and I actually leaned in and checked the audio levels twice because I thought the equipment had failed. Then, all at once, the audio caught up, like it had been buffering, and I heard maybe 4 full sentences, in a voice that was lower and slower than the one I'd taken vitals on 2 days earlier. I couldn't make out most of it. The one phrase I got clean was "not much longer now." The next morning I brought it to the ship's doctor, expecting him to back me up on escalating this, maybe getting her looked at on shore at the next port. Instead, he told me to keep it out of the official log as a psychiatric incident, and just note it as an unspecified sleep disturbance, responding to supportive care. When I pushed back, he got short with me, in a way that felt less like annoyance, and more like he didn't want to be having the conversation at all. It was the first time it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't new to him, so I went back through the medical archive on the ship's system that afternoon, looking for anything similar. Most of it was routine, but buried in an entry from 2 seasons earlier, there was a line, unattached to any passenger name I could find, using an internal code I didn't recognize, that just read, "Sleep event, resolved via early disembarkation, family notified." No further detail. No case number cross-reference. It read like someone had gone out of their way to write as little as possible. By day 6, Anne stopped complaining altogether. She came to the medical bay on her own again, but this time she was smiling, calm in a way that felt more unsettling than the sleeplessness had. I asked how she was doing, and she said she felt wonderful, better than she had in years, and that she finally understood what it wanted. I asked her what she meant by it, gently, the way you're trained to, when a patient says something that doesn't track. She just tilted her head at me, still smiling, and said it wasn't really her turn to explain that part. That afternoon, before I'd even finished writing up the interaction, I got a call from guest services saying Anne's family had arranged an early disembarkation at our next port, and a private medical transport was already being coordinated. I hadn't contacted any family. Nobody on my end had flagged this to shore support yet. When I asked how the family had been notified so quickly, the woman on the phone just said the request had come through corporate, not through us, and that it was already approved above her. At the port the next morning, a car was waiting before we'd even finished the tender process. 2 people in plain clothes who said they were with the family, and a transport service I'd never heard of in 6 years of doing exactly this kind of transfer. They had every form pre-filled. They didn't ask me a single question about her condition, which for a documented 4-day sleep disturbance with neurological symptoms is not normal. That's the kind of handoff where the receiving party grills you for 20 minutes. Anne walked off the ship on her own 2 feet, calm, unhurried, and didn't look back once. It nagged at me enough that a few weeks later, back on land between contracts, I did something I probably wasn't supposed to do, and pulled what records I still had access to on her booking. Her passport photo didn't match cleanly against the name on some of the earlier paperwork from her travel agent. A small enough discrepancy that nobody at check-in would have caught it, but enough that I started digging further. I found an incident report, sourced from a maritime medical forum where crew occasionally compare notes anonymously, describing an almost identical case on a different cruise line, 4 years earlier. Same progression, same phrase, nearly verbatim, about understanding what it wanted. Different woman, different name entirely, and yet buried in the passenger manifest details someone had cross-referenced, the same birth date as the woman I'd treated as Anne. Once I had that thread, I couldn't stop pulling it. Over the following months I found scattered references, never official, always second-hand, from nurses and doctors on other ships, describing versions of the same case going back at least a decade. Always a woman, traveling under a different name each time. Always the same shape to it, the impossible calm vitals, the repeated sentence to strangers, the voice at night, the sudden peace on day 5 or 6, and always resolved the same way. A transfer arranged faster than any legitimate family notification should move, handled by people nobody could later verify. I left the industry not long after that contract, not because of one bad case. I'd had worse in terms of actual medical horror, but because I couldn't make the facts sit still long enough to file them anywhere that made sense. I've stopped believing it was insomnia. I don't know what I believe it was. I was head of security on the overnight watch, which on a repositioning run means you're basically the only ones awake on a ship built for 4,000 people and carrying maybe 200. No passengers, no entertainment staff. Just crew moving the boat from one season to the next. Empty decks, empty pools. Your own footsteps echoing back at you down a hallway that's supposed to have music playing in it. The call came in at 2:40 in the morning. Deck 2, aft, crew storage corridor. Door 47 had triggered a security fault. The kind of alert that means a door sensor thinks it's been forced or jammed. Except when I pulled the log, it wasn't that. It said locked. From the inside. Door 47 didn't have an inside lock. Storage doors on that deck never did. Company policy, fire code, you don't want crew able to seal themselves into a closet with no way out. I checked the hardware spec twice before I even walked down there because I didn't believe what I was reading. I want to be clear, I've handled hundreds of these calls over the years. 99% of the time it's a sensor drifting out of calibration. Salt air does that to electronics faster than people think. I walked down there expecting to write it up in 5 minutes and go back to my coffee. The door opened fine. That part didn't match the alert at all, but the room did. According to the manifest, 47 held linen overflow and a rack of spare life vests. What I found was the shelving pushed against one wall, not stacked wrong, pushed, like somebody had cleared floor space on purpose. There were packing blankets folded into something that wasn't storage. It was bedding. A couple of empty water bottles. I'm not going to describe everything I saw in there, because some of it I still can't make sense of myself, and I'd rather not guess out loud. But nobody puts a room like that together by accident, and nobody on a 200-person skeleton crew does it without somebody else noticing. I reported it straight up the chain, the way you're supposed to. That's when I got my second surprise. I was standing in the staff captain's office, giving him the rundown, and one of the senior officers, older guy, been with the company a long time, said something like, "This is starting to sound like that girl from 3 cruises back." Not to me, almost to himself. The staff captain gave him one look and the sentence just stopped existing. Nobody explained it. Nobody brought it up again, not that night, not ever. No matter how many times I circled back around to it in conversation over the following weeks. I learned pretty fast that circling back around to it was not something they wanted me doing. The next morning, I got handed a draft incident report to sign off on. Cause of alarm, electrical fault, door sensor. I'd been the one in that corridor. I'd pulled the wiring diagram myself. There was no fault. The sensor was reading exactly what it was built to read, which was a door someone had locked from a side that physically could not lock. I said as much. I was told, pretty evenly, that electrical was how it was going in the log. Not a request. I signed it. I want to say I fought harder than I did. I didn't. 2 days after that, doing a final sweep of 47 before we sealed it back up for the season, I found a crew ID clipped down behind where the shelving had been shoved. Laminated card, company logo, photo of a woman I didn't recognize, employee number, no name I'd ever heard called over a radio or seen on a duty roster. I ran her number that same shift, quiet, on my own terminal, not through anybody. The system had her listed as voluntary resignation, Port of Ketchikan, a full cruise before whatever conversation that officer had swallowed in the staff captain's office. Voluntary resignation means you sign out at the gangway. I pulled the gangway log for that date out of habit more than suspicion. Her name was never on it. She was marked as leaving a ship she never walked off of. I sat with that for about 4 days before I did anything with it. And what I did was ask one more question, to the wrong person, in the wrong tone. Within an hour, I had a meeting I didn't request, with a man from shoreside management I'd met exactly once before, who came all the way down to my deck to tell me, very calmly, very plainly, that I needed to stop asking about door 47. Not why, not what happened to her, just stop. He wasn't loud about it. That's what stuck with me more than if he had been. He said it like he'd said it before, to somebody else, and it had worked. So I stopped. I finished that contract. I finished a couple more after it, and I never said her name out loud on that ship again. Almost a year later, I was off contract, back on land, at a hiring hall the way you end up talking to people who used to work the same boats you did. I got to talking with a woman who'd done 2 seasons on that same ship, different department. We'd never really crossed paths before. Small talk, mutual people we knew. At some point I mentioned the badge, just the number, half testing her, half just needing to say it to somebody who might actually understand it. I didn't even get the whole name out. Her face went somewhere else entirely. She put her coffee down like it had gotten too heavy to hold. She said, "Don't. Not here." And then, quieter, almost to herself, the same way that officer had done it a year earlier, I thought they'd gotten everyone who saw that room, not asked about it, saw it. Meaning I wasn't the only one standing in 47 at some point over the years. Meaning whatever this was, it had a pattern to it long before I ever got that alarm call. She wouldn't say another word after that. Wouldn't confirm the name, wouldn't tell me who the woman was to her, wouldn't tell me what gotten meant. She finished her drink and left, and I never ran into her again, and I've never gone looking. I'm not going to tell you the name on that badge. I've had a year and change to decide whether that's cowardice or something closer to self-preservation, and I honestly don't know anymore, and I'm not sure it matters which one it is. I did what I was told. I've regretted it every day since. I just don't know what I would have done differently. 5 days without a port. That's what a repositioning run looks like from where I stand, which is usually somewhere below the waterline with a flashlight and a clipboard. No passengers worth mentioning. A skeleton crew, just moving 40,000 tons of steel from one contract to the next across open water. I've done maybe 30 of these crossings in 22 years, and they all blur together after a while. This one didn't blur. This one I still think about. It started on the second night, the kind of small thing you only catch if you've spent half your life with your palm flat against a bulkhead, feeling for trouble before it shows up on a screen. I had my hand on a frame near the shaft alley, checking for the normal chatter you get off a running shaft. And underneath it, there was something else. A vibration, low and steady, coming from somewhere that wasn't the shaft, wasn't the reduction gear, wasn't anything I could place right away. I stood there a full minute just breathing and feeling it, and then it stopped, the way a hum stops when somebody switches off a fridge in the next room. I did what I always do, which is not panic and not guess. Next morning I pulled the vibration analysis package and ran a full diagnostic sweep across every rotating piece of equipment on that deck, cross-checked it against the accelerometers bolted to the shaft bearings, the generators, the compressors. Every reading came back clean. Not close to clean. Clean like the sensors had nothing to say at all. That bothered me more than a bad reading would have. A bad reading tells you where to look. This told me nothing, and I've been at this long enough to know that nothing is its own kind of answer. So I went old school. Over the next 2 nights I walked the whole lower deck frame by frame with my hand out, the way my first chief taught me before half this equipment existed. And I found it, not on the shaft, not near any engine, but on a run of hull plating a good 20 feet from the nearest piece of rotating machinery, down past the bilge pumps where there's nothing but empty tank space and steel. Nothing down there should vibrate at all. I checked it against the ballast log, checked for trapped air, checked for a loose baffle plate banging around. Nothing fit. Whatever was doing this wasn't mechanical, which is a sentence I don't like writing about a ship I'm responsible for. Then I noticed the timing. It only happened at night. Not just quiet hours, but a specific window. Always after midnight, always gone by 4. And it only happened out here, in deep water, days from anywhere. We'd left port with nothing, and somewhere past the continental shelf it had started right up. I ran that pattern past myself 3 or 4 times, looking for a reasonable explanation. Temperature differential, hull flexing as it cooled, something about pressure at depth, and none of it explained why it would start and stop on a clock instead of a curve. By the 4th or 5th night I'd stopped calling it random. It had developed a rhythm, even and unhurried, spaced out in a way that machinery doesn't produce. Machines wear unevenly. They speed up, they stutter, they tell on themselves. This didn't stutter. It was patient, like something enormous taking its time, step after step after step, never rushing to catch up with itself. I'm not a man who reaches for that kind of comparison easily. I reached for it because it was the only one that fit. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. One of the junior engineers, Danny, came up from a night watch pale in a way 24-year-olds don't usually get. He'd been down near that same section, and as a joke, he told me he'd knocked twice on the plating, the way you'd knock on a door. He said something knocked back. Not an echo, not a delay. A direct answer. Same 2 knocks, same spacing, coming from inside the steel rather than off it. He asked to be reassigned off nights. I told him I'd look into it, and he told me, dead serious, that he wasn't going back down there alone, regardless of what I decided. I didn't say it to him, but I went down and tried it myself 2 nights later. I knocked out an irregular little sequence on the plating, 3 quick, 1 slow, a pause, 2 more. Nothing a person would guess by accident. What came back matched it almost exactly, half a second behind, clean as a mirror. An echo doesn't work that way. An echo doesn't wait, and it doesn't reproduce an irregular rhythm without smearing it. I stood there in the passageway a long time after that, telling myself I'd find the mechanical cause in the morning, the way I'd always found it before. What I actually found, digging through the old bound logbooks we still keep as backup to the digital records, was worse than not finding an answer. 10 years earlier, almost to the week, on this same ship, an engineer had logged an entry describing a vibration in the same section of hull. No source on diagnostics, only felt by hand, only at night. The wording wasn't just similar. Whole phrases matched mine almost word for word, and I hadn't read his entry before I wrote my own. 2 men a decade apart, describing the same thing in close to the same language, like the ship itself had dictated the report. I wanted to talk to him. I ran his name through the company crew database and found he'd sailed for us another 8 months after that voyage, and then never again. Not with us. Not with anyone, as far as I could trace. No accident on his record, no medical discharge, just a clean stop. A friend of a friend eventually got me a number for him, and I called it twice. He picked up the second time, heard which ship I was calling about, and told me, politely but completely, that he had nothing to say about that voyage, and asked me not to call again. He didn't sound frightened exactly. He sounded like a man who'd decided a long time ago not to think about something, and my call had cost him some effort to maintain that. That's when I went looking at the ship herself, not just her logs. Every vessel has a build history, and ours had an unusual one. She wasn't built whole. A chunk of her midship keel section had been salvaged and incorporated during construction. Steel and structural members pulled from another hull entirely, a cost-saving practice that used to be more common than owners like to admit now. The paperwork on where that steel came from was thin, the way paperwork from a shipyard that closed decades ago tends to be. What it did say was that the donor vessel had been decommissioned early, following a structural failure at sea. No further detail. Just those words, sitting in a scanned page of a file nobody had opened in years. It took me most of an afternoon on the satellite connection, and a call to a retired classification surveyor a colleague put me onto, to find out which ship that had actually been. She'd gone through the same kind of run we were on now. A repositioning crossing, no cargo, minimal crew, open ocean, night watch, when a section of her hull failed structurally somewhere around this same stretch of latitude. The account was old and second-hand, but consistent. It happened at night. It happened fast. What the surveyor mentioned almost as an aside, because to him it was just paperwork trivia and not something that would keep a man awake, was that the decommissioning file on that vessel had a quiet discrepancy in it. The crew count logged before the incident and the crew count logged after didn't fully reconcile. Nothing officially unresolved, nothing that made headlines. These things happened more than owners like to publicize, and eventually a line gets drawn and a file gets closed. But the numbers didn't match, and nobody, as far as the record showed, had ever gone back to ask why. Around the same time, the rhythm down in our own hull changed. It stopped being just an even, patient beat, and became something I could count. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. I stood there with my watch running, doing the count 3 separate nights to be sure I wasn't hearing what I wanted to hear, and it came out the same every time. That's not resonance. Resonance doesn't organize itself into groups. I've spent my whole career trusting that steel behaves according to physics I can measure, and for the first time in 22 years, I couldn't make myself finish that sentence with any confidence. I took all of it up the chain, the readings, the log entry from a decade back, the salvage history, the count. The captain listened, to his credit, longer than I expected. But we were 2 days from the nearest yard with any berth availability. The schedule had no slack built into it, and the phrase that came back down to me, more or less, was that I should log it as thermal expansion noise and leave it there. Nobody wanted a structural inquiry opened on a repositioning run with no passengers aboard and a contract waiting at the other end. I understood the reasoning. I didn't like it, but I understood it, and I logged it the way I was told. 2 nights later, Danny didn't show up for a parts run I'd sent him on. He wasn't answering the radio, and after 20 minutes of that going nowhere, I went looking myself. I found him sitting on the deck plates down in the shaft alley. Lights on. Nothing wrong with him that a doctor could point to, except he had no memory of walking there, and kept saying, "Calm," in a way that scared me more than panic would have, that someone had called his name from inside the hull. Not a voice generally. His name specifically, said the way someone who knew him would say it. The spot where he was sitting was the exact frame I'd been tracking the vibration to for 5 nights running. I hadn't told him which frame it was. He had no reason to know. On the last night before we were due to raise the coast, the vibration stopped. Not faded, stopped. The way something stops when it's finished, rather than interrupted. I remember standing in that passageway almost grateful, and then noticing every clock in the engineering spaces. 3 separate systems on 3 separate power feeds that have no reason to drift together, were reading 9 minutes fast. Not 9 minutes off from ship's time in 3 different directions, the way a fault would scatter them. 9 minutes fast, every one, in agreement with each other, and with nothing else. I went back to that old decommissioning file that night, because by then I couldn't leave it alone. And buried in a page I'd skimmed past twice before was a timestamp discrepancy from the original incident. The gap between when the failure was first logged by the watch on duty and when it was radioed in was recorded as 9 minutes, unexplained even at the time, chalked up to a clock error nobody chased down, because there were bigger problems that night. And under that entry, faded but legible, was a signature. I recognized the hand before I placed the name. The same steady, slightly forward-leaning script I used to watch write up the evening orders on my very first ship, 20 years ago, from a chief who taught me most of what I still do without thinking about it, and who I'd lost track of the way you lose track of people once you both move on to other vessels. I don't know yet what that means, or if it means anything at all, and I've decided I'm not in a hurry to find out. Metal doesn't remember things. That's what I keep telling myself anyway. I want to say up front that I'm not the kind of guy who sees things. I don't believe in star signs. I think most true crime podcasts are just gossip with a serious voiceover, and I've never once felt a cold spot in a house and thought ghost instead of bad insulation. I'm telling you that so you understand where I was standing, mentally, before any of this happened. Because by the end of the week, I was standing somewhere very different, and I didn't walk there on purpose. This was a Caribbean cruise, one of those floating cities with 18 decks and a casino that never turns its lights off. Peak season, the ship was rammed, every pool chair claimed by 6 a.m., with a towel and a paperback nobody was ever going to finish. I was solo. Not sad solo, just solo. My second cruise ever. No status, no loyalty points worth mentioning. The kind of gambler who brings $40 to the tables and calls it a night out of principle, not budget. It was around 1 in the morning, 3rd night out, and I was down about that same $40 when a man in a white dinner jacket appeared at my elbow. Not a dealer, not security. Different uniform, sharper. The kind you see on the crew who work the specialty restaurants. He used my name, not sir, my actual first name, like we'd met before, which we hadn't. He said I'd been selected for a private late seating. A loyalty recognition, very limited, very quiet. Would I follow him? And look, I know how that sounds now. At the time, it sounded like free steak. I laughed and said something like, recognition for what? My incredible skill at losing at blackjack. And he smiled in a way that didn't really answer the joke. And I followed him anyway, because I was a little drunk and a lot flattered. He walked me through a door I hadn't noticed before, off the side of the casino floor, down a service corridor with exposed pipe on the ceiling, and out into the main dining room, the big formal one, 500 seats, completely dark except for a single table near the windows. One table, one chair pulled out, linen, silver, a candle already lit, He gestured for me to sit like this was the most normal thing in the world, like this happened every night to somebody. I asked how I'd qualified for something like this, expecting a number, a tier, something I could brag about later. He just said it was a loyalty perk, a phrase he repeated twice, like it was the whole explanation. And then he was gone before I could ask a follow-up. And I remember thinking, this guy has the worst customer service instincts of anyone I've met on this ship. And also, this candle is a nice touch. The food started coming without me ordering anything. Course after course. A seared scallop thing, a soup I couldn't identify but wanted more of, a wine that was better than anything I'd normally spring for. I was fully enjoying myself at this point, texting my sister a photo of the dessert plate with the caption, "Apparently I'm VIP now," feeling like the whole trip had just paid for itself. It was somewhere around the second bottle that I noticed the seat across from me had changed. I hadn't looked at it in a while. Why would I? It was empty. But now, the napkin that had been folded into that little fan shape was lying flat, half open, like someone had picked it up and put it back down badly. The water glass across the table had a ring of condensation on the cloth that hadn't been there before, and the chair itself was angled out a few inches, the way a chair sits after somebody's gotten up from it. I sat there for a second doing the math on that, and the math didn't work, because nobody had walked past me. I would have seen them. The room was silent enough that I would have heard a chair leg scrape on that floor. I told myself a busser had come by while I was looking at my phone. That's a normal thing to tell yourself. So when a steward walked through with a tray a few minutes later, I asked him casually how long the private seating program had been running, just making conversation. He stopped, actually stopped walking, and said he wasn't familiar with any program like that. I laughed and described it. The empty room, the one table, the guy in the white jacket, and he just gave me this polite, blank look, the kind service staff give you when they think you might be drunk and are deciding whether that's their problem. I went looking for the guy who'd walked me in. I checked with the host stand at the entrance, described him, the jacket, roughly his age. Nobody on shift matched that. Nobody remembered walking a guest in an hour ago. And the reservation screen behind the desk, when the host turned it toward me to be helpful, didn't have a booking under my name for that dining room at all that night. Not canceled, not there. I went back to the casino because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and because some stubborn part of me wanted to laugh about it with somebody who'd get the joke. I ended up telling the pit boss I'd gotten to know over the week, half as a story, half fishing for an explanation. He actually knew exactly what I meant. Said, oh yeah, the private seating thing. Some guy used to run that as an off-book perk for high rollers. Very old school, very us taking care of our own. And then he said the part that took the floor out from under me. That guy hadn't worked on this ship in 2 years. He said it the way you'd mention any old coworker, no weight to it at all. And I just stood there with my chips in my hand, not saying anything. Back in my cabin, I pulled up the cruise app, mostly to prove to myself that some record existed, that I hadn't imagined the whole night. There was nothing. No reservation under my name, no reservation under my room number, no charge on my folio for a bottle of wine that definitely wasn't complimentary. As far as the ship's own system was concerned, I had eaten dinner at the buffet like every other night and gone to bed at a reasonable hour. The next morning I ran into the steward who did our hallway, a guy named Reyes who I'd tipped well and chatted with most days about nothing. Kids, football, how bad the Wi-Fi was. I described the man in the white jacket to him too, hoping for a normal answer this time. Reyes's face did something I didn't like. He said he knew who I was talking about. And then he said, almost under his breath, that I didn't want to know that story, and went back to his cart before I could push. That was worse than the blank stares. A blank stare means nobody knows anything. Reyes knowing something and refusing to say it meant there was something to know. That night I went back down to the dining deck around 2, told myself I was just going to look, nothing more. The doors were locked, the room dark the way a closed restaurant is supposed to be dark. Except through the glass, off to the side, near the windows, there was one table still lit. Same candle, same white cloth, glowing in an otherwise pitch-black room that had no service scheduled for another 6 hours. I stood there long enough that my own reflection started overlapping with it in the glass, and I made myself walk away before I could think too hard about what I was looking at. Lying in my cabin, I pulled up that dessert photo I'd sent my sister, the one from the first night, and zoomed in, out of some compulsion I couldn't explain to myself. Behind my own shoulder, in the dark window glass across the table, there was a shape. Not a face. Nothing that clean. Just a smear of something paler than the black background where nothing should have been reflected at all. Right about where a person's head would sit if they were leaning forward in that empty chair. I texted my friend Marcus that night, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to somebody who wasn't on the ship, half joking that apparently cruise ships come with a haunted dinner option now. He didn't laugh it off the way I expected. He went quiet for a few minutes, and then sent me a photo from his own phone. An old one, different ship, same cruise line, from a trip he'd taken years before I knew him. Same dining room style, same single table set for one, same candle, same chair pulled out at that same unnatural angle. He said it had happened to him too, word for word almost, an invitation from a guy he never saw again, and he'd never told anyone because it sounded insane, and he figured it was just a weird one-off thing the crew did for lonely-looking guests. Seeing my photo was the first time in 6 years he'd thought about it twice. Once I had that thread to pull, I couldn't stop pulling it. I spent the next 2 nights not sleeping, searching old cruise forums instead, the kind where people compare port days and complain about deck chair hogs. Buried in there, spread across different ships and different years, were these odd, half-embarrassed posts. People describing almost exactly what had happened to me, always brushed off by other posters as an urban legend among frequent cruisers. Something people called the good invite, or table for one, always followed by someone saying it never happened to them and they'd cruised 40 times. One post, older than the rest, linked to a local news brief from years back, barely a paragraph, about a longtime crew member on this same cruise line, lost overboard during bad weather on a repositioning voyage, a headwaiter who'd worked private dining for VIP guests for over a decade. The description in that brief matched, roughly, the outline of what Reyes hadn't wanted to tell me. I sat with that for a long time, not because I thought a dead man had personally poured my wine, but because it meant this wasn't random, and it wasn't new, and whatever it was had a shape to it that other people had bumped into before me and walked away from, just as unable to explain it. What sat worst with me wasn't the idea of a ghost. It was noticing the pattern once I looked for it. Always a solo traveler, always mid-cruise, never the same ship twice in a row, the invitation always coming from someone nobody could account for afterward. It stopped feeling like something happening to me, and started feeling like something that had been happening, on a schedule, to people exactly like me, long before I ever booked this trip. That seat across the table wasn't empty by accident. It was set for somebody. I just didn't know anymore, whether I'd been the guest that night, or the stand-in for someone else's unfinished dinner. I flew home a day after the cruise ended, and didn't think about booking with that line again. Then, about 3 weeks later, an email landed in my inbox from their loyalty program, inviting me to an exclusive returning guest dining experience on my next voyage, one I had never signed up for, and have no cruise currently booked to redeem. I've read that email more times than I'd like to admit, looking for a detail that makes it ordinary. I haven't found one yet. I keep telling people it was a mix-up. I don't actually believe that anymore. I was 7 years into ship work before that night, and I want to say I'd seen everything by then. Man-overboard drills. We ran them like clockwork, every Tuesday on the Caribbean run. Same horn pattern, same mustering, same guy from housekeeping who always showed up late, buttoning his shirt. Nobody's heart rate went up for those anymore. That's the whole point of drilling. You train the fear out of the moment so the body just moves. Mine moved that night too, right up until it didn't. We were maybe 4 hours out of port, deep water, no lights but our own for miles. I was running the aft rail station, doing the head count check on my section, when one of the younger guys, kid named Petrov, grabbed my arm without saying anything first. That's what got me, not his voice, his hand. He just pointed down at the wake, and there was something pale rolling in the foam behind the stern, low in the water, gone under the surface chop before I could get a clean look. I called it in as a possible visual on a person in the water, because that's the protocol, and for about 90 seconds I actually believed it. Then the bridge came back with the head count. Every cabin accounted for. Every crew member checked in. Nobody missing. That's the part that should have ended it right there. No name, no gap, no reason to keep the ship in search pattern. Except the officer on the bridge didn't stand us down. He kept us out there, engines idling back, spotlights sweeping. That's the first thing that didn't sit right with me. In 7 years, I'd never seen them keep a full search running with a clean count. The sonar operator came over the radio maybe 10 minutes later, and his voice had changed. He said he had a return trailing the wake, holding position off the stern quarter, matching our speed almost exactly, not drifting past like debris would, not the scatter you get off a pod of dolphins working the wash, holding, like it was pacing us. I remember standing at the rail with the spotlight crew, and none of us said the word out loud, but we were all thinking the same shape a body makes when it's face down, and the current hasn't taken it yet. The captain ordered a course change, a wide turn to bring us back over the same stretch of water, so the search boat could get a fix. And the return dropped off sonar the second we started to turn. Just gone. We chalked that up to angle, to the hull blocking the signal, whatever explanation lets you keep doing your job. Then we came back around onto the original heading, and it was there again. Same spot. Almost exactly where we would have been if we'd never turned at all. Like it hadn't moved with us. It had waited for us to come back to it. I saw it myself that time. Pale. Just under the surface. There and then not there the moment the spotlight held steady on it. I've told myself for years it was a trick of the light on white foam. I've never fully believed myself when I say that. We ran that search for almost 2 hours. No body, no debris, no life vest, nothing recovered. Around 3 a.m. the captain called it, and we logged it as a completed drill with a false visual contact. Standard write-up. I signed my portion and went to bed and didn't sleep. What got under my skin wasn't the water. It was 2 days later, doing paperwork with the safety officer, when I noticed the drill schedule didn't have that Tuesday listed as a scheduled exercise. It had been added same day. I asked about it, half joking, figured maybe corporate changed the calendar. She told me, quieter than she needed to, that the order had come down from the bridge that afternoon, before my shift even started. Somebody had called something in. She wouldn't say who or what. That's when the night stopped being a strange shift and started being a question I couldn't put down. I asked a friend in the purser's office, off the record, if she'd run any manifest checks that week. She had. Routine cross-reference against maritime incident logs for that stretch of water. Something they did quietly whenever there was an unscheduled search, she said, just in case a name matched a report from another vessel. She wouldn't tell me what came back, just that it wasn't nothing, and that it wasn't something they were putting in front of crew. I went to my department head with it, plainly, because I wanted an answer more than I wanted to keep my head down. He told me, almost gently, that some things get handled above deck level, and that chasing it wouldn't bring anybody back, and wouldn't do me any good either. That was the first time anyone in a position over me had implied there was a back to bring somebody from. Not a hypothetical, not a drill scenario, an actual somebody. I left that contract at the end of the season, told myself it had nothing to do with that night, even though it had everything to do with it. It was almost a year later, working a different line, when I ran into a guy I'd trained with, deck crew on a sister ship, running the same Caribbean route. We were having beers on a stopover, and I brought it up carefully, testing him, not expecting anything. I described the pale shape in the wake, the sonar contact holding speed, the way it vanished on the turn and came back on the old heading. He went quiet, in a way that told me before he said a word. He'd had almost the identical night. Different ship, different year, same stretch of water, unscheduled drill called same day, no missing persons, a contact that paced the stern and disappeared and reappeared on the original course. I asked him if he'd reported it up. He laughed, but not like it was funny. Said everybody who's worked that route long enough has a story like it, or knows somebody who does, and none of them talk about it outside of nights like this one, 2 beers in, safely off the ship. That's when I understood it wasn't an incident. It was a pattern nobody with any authority wanted spoken into a microphone. Ships have run that passage for over 100 years. People have gone into that water and not come back for just as long. and not every one of them made it into a report anybody outside the company ever reads. I don't work ships anymore. I think about that stretch of dark water more than I'd like to admit, usually late, usually when I can't sleep anyway. I think about the head count that came back clean, and the drill that wasn't on the schedule until that afternoon, and the shape that knew exactly where the ship would have been. We logged it as a drill. I still think about what we were actually looking for. I spent 31 years working ships. Started as a cabin steward's assistant on a boat that doesn't exist anymore. Some of it now scrap metal off a beach in Bangladesh for all I know. And finished as a purser, which, if you don't know the job, means I was the one who knew where everybody was supposed to be. Manifests, keys, complaints, the passenger who lost his passport, the couple in 6214 who wanted a bigger room after they'd already unpacked. 31 years of knowing where everybody was supposed to be, except for the people in cabin 8102. The first one I remember clearly was an older man, 70s maybe, traveling by himself on a 2-week repositioning cruise, the kind retired folks take because they've got nowhere else to be, and the fare's cheap when the ship's just moving from one ocean to another. He checked in fine. Photo matched his passport. Card worked at the muster drill. Steward saw him go into his cabin that first night with his suitcase. Small thing, but I remember the suitcase because it had a strap wrapped around it, the kind people used before wheels got good. An old habit from an older kind of travel. He never came back out. Not for the second night's dinner seating he'd requested. Not for the shore excursion he'd already paid for. The steward knocked. Got no answer. Used the master key out of concern more than procedure. And the cabin was empty. Bed made like it had been made by housekeeping, not slept in. Suitcase still on the rack, strap still buckled. Nobody on a ship just leaves a suitcase. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for everything I'm about to tell you. On a ship, a missing passenger is not a small thing. There are procedures. There's a search of every public space, a check of the 6TV, a call to the bridge, sometimes a call to the Coast Guard if you're close enough to a jurisdiction that has one. I've been part of 2 of those searches in my career, for other cabins, other people, and both times the ship turned inside out looking. Announcements. Overtime. Officers not sleeping. None of that happened for the man in 81002. By the next morning, the incident report had already closed itself out. I saw the paperwork later, because part of my job was reconciling manifests against disembarkation records, and his name showed a checkout at the next port, matched against a shore pass that, as far as I could tell, nobody actually swiped. I flagged it to my supervisor at the time, an old company man who'd been at sea longer than I'd been alive, and he told me, not unkindly, that some things get handled above the purser's desk, and that I should let it go, not as a threat, as advice, the kind of advice you give somebody you don't want to see get hurt. I let it go, because I was 30 years old and I liked my job and I had a mortgage back home, and a wife who liked that I had a steady income even if it meant I was gone 8 months a year. That's the plain truth of it. I've made my peace with that part, mostly. What I couldn't quite let go of was something a steward told me a few months after. An older Filipino man named Bert, who'd been aboard longer than almost anyone. I asked him, careful, sideways, whether he remembered anything strange about 8-102. He didn't even look up from what he was doing. He said, "That's the room, boss. Don't book it for anybody you like." I asked him what he meant by that, and he just repeated it, like it was a piece of folklore that had been handed to him whole, and he wasn't going to be the one to unpack it further. That was the first time I understood I wasn't looking at something new. I was looking at something that had already been happening before I ever set foot on that ship. For the next several cruises, 8102 simply didn't sell. It sat on the deck plan marked with a little maintenance flag, the kind that usually means a plumbing issue or a broken air handler, something engineering's working on. I checked the engineering work order log out of habit one slow afternoon in port. There was no order for 8102. No plumber had been sent. No electrician. The flag existed in the booking system, and nowhere else, which meant somebody with authority over the booking system, not engineering, had put it there and left it. Years passed. I moved to a different rotation, came back to that same ship on a later contract, the way you do in this industry. ships and crew circling back around each other over a career. And it happened again. A woman this time, middle-aged, traveling with a friend who'd gone to bed early and left her in the lounge with a glass of wine. The friend said the woman mentioned she was heading back to the cabin around 11. Cabin was 8102, reopened for booking by then. No memory in the system apparently of why it had ever been closed. The friend woke up the next morning alone, in a room that was booked for 2, and by that afternoon, the same quiet machinery I remembered from years before had already turned over. No search worth the name, no urgency, just a manifest correction and a closed file. I want to tell you I did something dramatic at that point. I didn't. What I did was start keeping my own notes, off the books, in a personal notebook I never let out of my cabin. Dates, cabin numbers, whatever fragments I could gather about who'd been booked in 8102 over the years. It felt like a small, cowardly kind of rebellion, writing things down that I was too afraid to say out loud to anyone who could actually do something with them. But it was what I had. There was a second officer around that time, a friend of mine, sharp, ambitious, the kind of person who asks questions because she genuinely can't help herself. She got curious about the same pattern I had, pulled at it harder than I ever dared, went to management with a formal query about the cabin's incident history. Within 6 weeks, she was transferred to a different vessel in the fleet. A promotion on paper, a better route, more money. She never talked about it again after that. Not even privately, not even to me. I don't know if that was fear, or if it was simply that she'd been given something good enough to make the questions not matter anymore. Either way, I understood the message even though nobody had ever said it to my face. Asking gets you moved, it doesn't get you answers. Still, I requested the full cabin history for 8102 once, using my purser's access, framed as a routine audit so it wouldn't raise flags. Every other cabin on that ship had a clean paper trail going back to its original fit-out. Every renovation, every incident, every complaint logged and dated. 8102's file thinned out the further back I went, and then simply stopped, years before the rest of the ship's records did, as if that one cabin's history had been quietly pruned, while everything around it stayed intact. Around that same stretch, I got hold of an old deck plan from an earlier refit, one from before I'd ever worked that vessel, back when the ship sailed under a different owner and a different name entirely, the way older ships often do when they get sold down the chain from one cruise line to another. I was only looking for reference measurements for a renovation project I was helping coordinate, but there it was on that decades-old blueprint. Same deck, same position, same number. 8102. The ship had changed hands, changed names, changed nearly everything else about itself over the years, and that one cabin had carried its number and its footprint across every version of the vessel, like something that refused to be renamed, along with everything else. There was a call I overheard once, not by design, just because the purser's office and the guest relations desk share a wall thinner than either of us liked. A woman on the phone, calling about her mother, who she said had been aboard on a cruise the month before and hadn't called home the way she usually did. The person on our end told her, calm and rehearsed, that her mother had canceled before boarding, that there was no record of her ever having sailed. I had processed that woman's boarding myself. I had seen her hand over her documents at the gangway, seen her photograph pulled up on my own screen, matched to her key card for cabin 8102. Whatever was being told to that daughter on the phone was not simply a company staying quiet. It was a company actively rewriting what had happened, and doing it smoothly enough that I believed, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have believed it too. I thought seriously, once, about going outside the company with what I had. A maritime authority, a journalist, somebody. I got as far as drafting an email I never sent. What stopped me wasn't loyalty. It was 30 years in, a pension I was 11 months from vesting fully, and the honest knowledge that what I had was a notebook full of dates and a feeling. Nothing that would survive a lawyer's first phone call. I told myself I'd say something after I retired, when I had nothing left to lose. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters at the end of this. My very last contract on that ship, she went in for a major refit, months in a shipyard, nearly every cabin gutted down to the steel and rebuilt to a new standard. I walked the decks during the planning phase, because part of my closing duties was reconciling the renovation schedule against the passenger cabin inventory. Every single stateroom on that deck was on the list. Every one, except 8102, which didn't appear anywhere in the refit plan at all, as though someone had gone through and deliberately lifted it out before the documents were ever circulated. I asked about it, framed as a scheduling oversight, and was told simply that the cabin was being held out of scope for this cycle. No further explanation offered, and by then, I knew better than to ask for one. I went and stood in front of that door once more, before I signed off my last contract for good. Every other cabin on the ship used the same electronic lock system, the same master override any senior officer could access in an emergency. My master key didn't work on 8102. It never had, I realized, thinking back over every year I'd carried it. That door had never once opened for me. I retired not long after. Different life now. On land, garden, grandchildren, the ordinary quiet you'd expect. But I still have a friend who sails with that company, still on that same ship, and a few months back I asked her, half joking, half not, to check something for me on the booking system. Cabin 81002, upcoming season. It came back booked. Single occupancy. A name neither of us recognized. Someone who has no idea, the way none of them ever seemed to, that they've booked into something the rest of the crew has spent decades quietly not talking about. That ship is still sailing. That cabin is still booked. And I still don't know what happens to the people who stay in it.